Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I
Okay.
hope anyone out there can hear me. Oh, I love the blue. I love the yellow. And I love the theme for today. Melody, how are you? Jessica and Tuvia, thank you so much for reaching out to us. And Jessica says she can hear us now.
I think if there's one thing to be afraid of, it's technological difficulties, right?
I
Or
live in
like no
terror of it.
power,
I can't stand it.
no power, no internet. It's one of those things I find fascinating because for me at least, and I'll be curious to hear your perspective on this, Scott and Jessica, and anyone else who can relate to this. In your mind, or at least in my mind, I think that I'm doing everything needed, taking all the right steps, and yet, boom, just one minor, whether it's a click of a button that says microphone on or microphone off, or like volume 1 degree more or 1 degree less, it truly does make a difference. And I think if anything else, what I'm choosing to take away from this particular situation is that there are very few things in life that I truly can control.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think I just sometimes have to dive into the experience and let the experience unfold and teach me what it's supposed to be teaching me.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, at least, there's, though, a little bit of a hard line there, or I should say a confusing line. And
Hmm.
I'm not always sure when I'm crossing it or not. So, for instance, a few years ago, I went for a standard skin check. And there was a mole that I've had on my foot for 20 years at least, maybe actually more like 30, 35, since before I was born. And they examined it. They suggested that I have a biopsy of it, and they did a biopsy, and they discovered that there were a few bad cells in there. Now, these cells hadn't gone outside of the mole. They were just a few cells, but they decided to remove the mole completely. And it was one of those things where when they called me up to say that there had been the issues with these cells within that mole, I was shocked. I'm half black, and according to my very uninformed thinking, that provided some protection. I have never been a sun worshiper. I don't like to go to the beach. I don't if even here in New York City, if I'm walking on, if there are two sides of the street to walk on, even if it's not particularly sunny, I'll still go on the shady side just to stay out of the sun. I've never walked around Central Park without a shirt on or any of these things that people do. I don't like getting tans. I never have. Yet still there was this issue. Now, when I told the nurse this, she said, "Well, Scott, Bob Marley thought the same thing too. He died of skin cancer." He basically took the attitude, from what I understand, nature's going to take care of this, whatever. And he let it go, and he ended up dying a very painful, tragic, and unnecessary death. So where do you draw the line? I can and should take actions to take care of myself, as opposed to, or I should go those extra miles, and it's upon me as an agent of responsibility for the outcomes in my own life as a philosophical approach to the world versus, say, sometimes you just can't control things and it happens. And so in my case, obviously, I chose to not take Bob Marley's route to dealing with this situation, and I'm glad I did that. But in areas where the decision points might be a little bit more gray, how do you make those decisions? And I will say this: death by cancer, going back to the topic of the day, what are some things that we should be afraid of? That is something I think, if it's utterly and completely preventable, that we should be scared of. I've never known anyone to die of cancer who's just thought it was some pleasant little fade out.
Do you find yourself that in those situations, are you more afraid of certain illnesses and disease compared to others? I mean, for example, when I think about my own life, I can definitely relate. I think components of cancer, to me, they're just some things that I fear a lot more than, let's say, like, I don't know, dying from the flu or whatever it might be. And I don't know if it has to do with the fact that I have so many connection points to that disease, so to speak. You know, I have
Yeah.
people in my family who have passed from it. I have people outside of my friend group who have passed from it as well. So those reference points build a story. They build a narrative of what it looks like to go through it and what it looks like once the person has passed due to it. And so I'm wondering, does that fear in your case, does it become more magnified when you have a reference point associated with it compared to some of the other things that you haven't experienced?
Mhm. I have an interesting and somewhat humorous, although perhaps a little crass answer to that question. But before I get into that, I wanted to express to Jessica my sorrow over what you shared in the comments a minute ago. I didn't know that. That's absolutely devastating. Yeah. And lack of sun, vitamin D. I do take vitamin D actually because I have to wear sunscreen everywhere I go when I go outside at this point. And even if I'm walking across the street to the bodega, I put on sunscreen, but I take vitamin D exactly because I don't want to have the collateral side effects of not having appropriate sun exposure. That is, again, something I think that we should be afraid of. But that's about me for a moment. Really, this is about Jessica, and love to your brother. And I hope he's resting in peace and finding joy and fulfillment wherever he is, on whatever plane. So, as I believe I've shared before on either this show or our other show, just a squirrel, our other squirrel. When I was in my late 30s, I was diagnosed with very, very high blood glucose levels, shockingly high. Looking back on it, I don't know how I was able to make it through the day with blood glucose that was that high. And I took medicine for it. It helped to some extent, but it really wasn't moving in the direction that I wanted it to. And I didn't want to be someone that wasn't even 40 yet and walking around like a zombie because I was on so much medicine that I felt like a corpse that had been reanimated somehow. And so I talked to my doctor about it. He basically said, look, Scott, yeah, you say you don't want to do this, but most Americans say they don't want to be on medicine. They don't do what they need to do in order to not be on medicine. You need to take responsibility for your health. Most people don't, so I'll believe it when I see it. So being who I am, I had to prove him wrong. And I went and got some books on diabetes in particular. And I read them. And every book on diabetes has the chapter, it's standard. What are the side effects? And they listed the usual ones that I'd known about, like blindness or losing limbs or open ulcers that don't heal, all of that sort of stuff. And I'd heard it so much, it didn't really affect me. And I have to admit, somewhere in my mind, I was like, well, if I lose one eye, I'll always have another. If I lose one finger, I'll always have 9. What on earth was going through my mind? I think that goes to the power of denial or the will to overcome fear. But in one of those books, it said, and none of the others said this one. In one of those books, it said that if your diabetes or your blood glucose is not controlled over time, you lose the ability to control your sphincter muscles as well as the feelings in your lower intestines. And so you lose the ability to control your bowels. Now, at the time, I was big time. And I always have been. I've been very athletic. I can tell y'all this. As ridiculous as it might seem, I might not have been afraid of losing a limb or an eye for reasons that I've got to say were pretty doggone foolish. But losing control of my bowels, y'all, that wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen. And that got my attention. I was not going to live my life in diapers or sitting down for a meeting and all of a sudden being in a brown puddle. So I got my diet shape so fast, it wasn't even funny. Why? Because that was something that I should have been afraid of. And I might not have had any contextualization. I have never known anyone in my life who has had that particular side effect from uncontrolled glucose levels. So I really had no context for it, but I was very vividly and easily able to imagine what that would be like, as well as the feeling states that I had would have associated with it, which were intolerable to even begin to contemplate. Sort of like the idea of, I've never experienced living through a nuclear bomb, but you can imagine the consequences so vividly and with such clarity that it will make it very obvious that if I ever hear a nuclear missile is coming towards New York City, my rear end is out the door.
Yeah. I have a question in regard to what you just shared, because I think you brought up a very interesting point. At least it's interesting for me, and I hope it's interesting for anyone else that's listening right now. But why is it that you, at least in your world, do you find that so many of the conversations revolve around overcoming things or not being afraid of them? And I've been curious about that. Why is it like that? Even the topic of this conversation, what are the things you should be afraid of, is a very different conversation than I think the conversation that takes place outside of it, at least in my world that I'm in, where much of it revolves around don't be afraid of anything, don't have fear, like find a way to eliminate, find a way to overcome that fear. And I've been trying to understand that, like, why is it like that? Is it because acknowledging the fear, is there something in acknowledging the fear that people don't feel comfortable discussing?
That's a good
does it make it
question.
more real than the reality of it? I never fully understood that.
Well, I'll throw something out for us to just think about, and I'm not claiming any rightness here. I'm just throwing it out as some thinking, and I would love to hear Melody, Jessica, Tuvia, anyone's, as well as your Oleg's thoughts on this. And Melody, yes, that was the push I needed. Yes. In any event, back to the topic. Part of what makes us human, in my opinion, and what has allowed us to transcend the environment that we're in as a species and to achieve what we have, to become the only species to our knowledge in the history of the planet that has the ability to willfully control our environment, to go into outer space, to create cures to diseases, to do any of the to create electronic equipment and then actually be able to use it as we're doing right now. Part of what has enabled us to do that has been mastery of our intellect, of our reasoning skills up here over our emotions. The emotions or the instincts, these very baseline level drives, are what enables species, along with limited or more or less limited intellectual development around things like strategy and groupthink and communication and crowd and social lives, right? Those things are all present to one extent or another in non-hominid animals. However, this prefrontal cortex type of thinking, the ability to imagine, the ability to construct, the ability to think ahead and plan accordingly, is, especially at the level human beings are at, is unprecedented in the animal kingdom. But we have evolved and moved forward with that very fast, and not all things have moved forward at the same level. We, as a species, just a few, less than 100,000 years ago, mindful of the fact that evolution takes, especially we were talking about things like the brain, that takes place at a scale over millions of years, not just a few thousand. But we were surviving based on our ability to respond to threats. Threats to the lack of food, threats especially to predation. And so fear is deeply hardwired into it. And interestingly enough, some of the characteristics of disorders like psychopathy that are foundational to those diagnoses relate to things like lack of fear, because it's outside of what is normally considered the healthy range of human emotions to have. And certainly if you didn't have fear in a primeval world, you could very easily die
Yeah, your life
quickly.
would be at risk.
Yeah, even if it's from not being afraid to try that new berry that you see on a tree, could die
Mm-hmm.
within a day.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that maybe the pervasiveness of that level of fear, and we haven't focused on it as a species, and it is coming from a place that's deeper in our brain stem. So it's again more foundational and more powerful in a way because it's persevered for so long in our history as a part of the animal kingdom. The capacities that the rational thinking part of our brains bring forward and can lead us to are, it's probably universally agreed upon, scarcely tapped at all.
Yeah.
But these baseline emotional responses keep us there. Every single person on this call and everyone that doesn't listen, I bet 10, 15, 20, 100 people that you see on the street every day have the intellectual power within them to unlock worlds of change.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is that they may not think that they can, but some of it may be that they're afraid to take the steps that they need to in order to get to that level. They're not
Mm-hmm.
even afraid of the success with these dreams and fantasies they have. They might be afraid to just spend the money to go to nursing school.
Mm-hmm.
Or they might be afraid to leave their home because their mom is sick, or because they don't know if they can afford another apartment. They might be afraid of homelessness if they quit that job where they're being abused. And then if they were to quit that and do something else, maybe that would take them, maybe the pressure that the real fear that we can face, particularly as entrepreneurs or people between jobs, of not having money, can be the seed from which true creativity bursts. But they're so afraid of that possibility that they're never able to put themselves in the position where they have that fear. I feel like all of these things are out there. And that's why I also think, although when it was said, it's been overused to such an extent that it's become cliche, but there's real truth, which is that the one thing that we should be afraid of is fear itself.
Yeah. Jessica brought up a really good, interesting point, as well as Melody. Fear, this is according to Jessica, like everything else, is subjective. It can also be something that can be helpful or harm, both physically and from a mindset perspective. And then Melody's point was, we do not need a healthy, we do not do not we do need a healthy amount of fear, but it has to be balanced, because otherwise we tend to intensify it beyond accuracy. And that,
Catastrophism.
yeah, and that's a very interesting point, because it makes me, what it made me think of, in especially in particular to Melody's comment, is I think it's one thing to be able to observe the quote unquote actual fear that's taking place. And it's a whole other thing to be able to create a narrative and intensify that fear beyond the actual situation.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm crossing the street, for example, this is the example that it made me think of, and looking left and right to see that there's no oncoming traffic that can potentially end my life, that's the reality of the situation. But taking that story and expanding it into what it's really not, and that's, me dying in X, Y, and Z way, and then not having anyone show up to my funeral, like all these other things, those are a few.
That would
That
never happen.
I hope not. I mean, you never know, but that's where I think it's, for me, it's interesting, as far as where is that line between acknowledging the actual fear of a situation and then intensifying that fear through a narrative of a fear that may not actually exist in the present moment.
Have you ever had any of your own worst fears actualized?
Fear of spiders, yes.
But like the fear that you have, did it actually come true?
No, no, I would say it hasn't. My fear of spiders, the thing that I fear the most from a spider, and I think this, for me, it comes from a lack of understanding. And especially when, let's say, it's a spider that's has a different texture, or the movement is different compared to some of the other spiders that I know of, it creates too much of an unknown and too much of an uncertainty in my mind, where it becomes very difficult for me to predict its movement or predict its intentions.
Mhm.
So, have I ever had the fear actualized? No, because the ultimate fear of that is dying from a spider bite
Yeah.
or getting killed by a spider,
Yeah.
and that hasn't happened to me. I've seen that happen in movies
Well, but
hundreds of times.
it is interesting because sometimes these fears being actualized or actually happening can also lead to other things which are good. So I
Yeah.
know of someone who was bitten by a brown recluse spider, and it was terrible.
Is that a poisonous one?
It is. It's it was in it was some random thing, and she ended up in the hospital in serious condition because of that.
Hmm.
However, while they were examining her body during the curing part, during the treatment of this terrible bite and dealing with the poison, they uncovered a cancer that would never have been discovered otherwise. And it was a dangerous one.
Wow.
So she ended up actually being in the hospital and recovering for a long time, but it was for a good reason. And that horrible thing that she would have feared, if I were her, I would have been afraid of. Even I think anyone rational is afraid of getting bitten by a poisonous spider. In her case, it actually happened, but it ended up being kind of a blessing. I mean, I'm sure she would rather have discovered the cancer another way, but there's no reason to believe, based on the facts that I heard, that it would have been uncovered,
Yeah.
but for this horrible experience.
Mm-hmm. How do you? I don't know if you know the answer to this, but how do you know if a spider is poisonous or not?
There are only limited species, and you can identify them, and they have very clear markings on them, which I have read were evolved in order to warn entities that might want to eat them, that I'm not to be
Oh,
eaten.
okay.
Yeah.
Because that's what I've been curious about when I see spiders, for example, in my apartment or whatever. That's the first thought that goes through my mind.
Yep. There's only two
What is-
species in America, is my understanding. Read about them. One is a black widow, one's a brown recluse. Maybe there's another one, but most of them are harmless. But yeah, I mean, still, they all kind of look alike, and most of us aren't going to spend our time waiting, getting out magnifying glass. Yeah,
Check it out.
exactly.
Okay, this one's good to go.
Right. Let it
This one
crawl
needs to
up
go.
let it crawl up my sleeve.
It's interesting that you even bring that up because it makes me think of in that situation where your friend was bitten by a spider, whether it was a blessing or a curse, maybe it's for her to decide kind of at that point. But I've been curious, and I think this probably ties into many of the conversations that we've had throughout this show as well, is that connection between events, probably all of the events, at least in my opinion, that sometimes I don't even see, and yet somehow each one does lead to another.
Well,
And that's at least how I process it. And it's just interesting for me to think about those situations where, for example, if I was bitten by a spider and found out that I had cancer, yes, there's a choice that I can make beyond that.
yeah.
Do I choose to make that as a part of my purpose and meaning in life and embark on this new chapter? But still, I find it fascinating how so many of the events in life, at least in my life, where I didn't expect them to go a certain way, actually turned out to be significantly better
Yeah.
because they showed me something that I didn't even know existed.
And Melody seems to point to that exact same thing in her comments about her own experience with a spider bite that led her into, herbals. I'm sorry that happened nonetheless. Sort of like my situation with blood glucose.
Yeah.
If I hadn't had that and wasn't on all that medicine, I might not be making the dietary choices that I do right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I look so good.
How did you find that out, actually?
What?
That
I look so good?
Yeah, both of those.
Just kidding, I know.
What event led you to discovery? Was it a random thing that kind of just made you want to explore it more, or was it an annual checkup?
Yeah, great question. I worked in social services for a long time. And when I started working in social services, I started getting colds all the time and flus. And at first I thought it was because it was like every 3 weeks. And I assumed it was because there were a lot of children in the shelter systems, and children are the vectors for these diseases. And then they spread out to the parents and then to the staff and then into the executive offices. So between that and the subway, I just assumed I was constantly being exposed to things, and my immune system never had the chance to recover, is what I assumed. But then I got one that settled in my throat, and my voice was like this. And it stayed like that for like 9 months. So finally I went to the doctor, and he said, you're not getting better because of this glucose. It's preventing your immune system from working right.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine, for someone like me, what it was like to have to talk like this all the time?
Mm-hmm.
That, it wasn't 9 months. I think it was 8 months.
But it changed your experience.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All the yelling and screaming I wanted to do, all of the overtop theatrics, how was I expected to live?
Yes. It would be a different version of Scott Mason. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. I wanted to bring up Jessica's comment as well about just different things that she chooses to share with her kids. She brings up a really good point at the very end. Why incite fear when something hasn't happened yet? So that question, to me, it's interesting for a couple reasons. First is because I probably do that. And I try and catch myself whenever I do that. So whether it's a conversation with whoever it might be, I'll try and buffer it, so to speak. I'll explain to them that, hey, what I'm going to say might put you on the path of making X, Y, and Z decisions. But I've been curious about it. And the reason why is because I remember one time I was walking with one of my friends outside, and there was a squirrel that was running across the street. And I guess it was just a squirrel. Yeah, part of it, just a squirrel family. But it was running across the street. And one of the things that my friend ended up doing was that she actually chased the squirrel until it was able to get onto the tree. And I remember in that moment specifically, I was asking her, why did she have to do that? And we got into this same exact conversation. And I mentioned to her, or I asked her a similar question. I said, why do you feel like you have to project more fear onto the squirrel, where the squirrel might actually be running for his or her life in that moment? And that's where it got me really curious as far as projecting our fears as individuals on others. And in your case, or anyone else that's listening, I'm curious to hear from you as far as what do you do? Are you aware of the fears that you project onto others? And if so, how do you do that? How do you personally know that, okay, this is a thing I might be afraid of? Like right now, let's pick a perfect example. COVID-19 happened, or it's happening, and travel has been an uncertainty for many people that I know of.
Mm-hmm.
So I get curious as far as what is the story that I choose to craft, and what's the narrative that I pass on to them that might acknowledge my fears, but doesn't project it in a way where it instills fears within them.
Mm-hmm. I suppose one answer could be a very careful framing of the conversation, saying that this is about me and my fears, and I want to make clear that I'm not imposing that on you. But the reason why I have to sit and contemplate that one for a minute is, if you're afraid of it, unless it's for something highly personal, I am afraid of having a diet that consists principally of brownies, because I am afraid of, again, my blood glucose spinning out of control, me needing to be on medicine, and then having that bowel issue that I spoke to you about before. So that's a highly personalized fear. But a lot of times if we're fearing things, it is a reason that it's not just something related to us. And so to me, it's one thing to have a conversation. I'm afraid of eating brownies all day because of blah, 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 that's about Scott Mason. It's another thing to be like Jessica. Don't put your hand on a hot stove. You'll burn it and you could
Mhm.
really injure yourself. And that is something people, again, going back to the original theme, should be afraid of. And perhaps you should be warning people, at least arguably, if there is danger out there. I was crossing the street the other day and there was an elderly in New York City. For those of you who don't know, no one pays attention to traffic lights. If you're a pedestrian,
I have
you just,
noticed that when I
yeah,
was
you just
there.
don't.
You just
And
go.
so, right. And in fact,
And you
Rudolph
cross in all
Giuliani,
directions. That
in
was
all
the
the,
most fascinating part to me. I've
yeah,
never, I kid you not, not to interrupt you, but before I
no,
got to New York, I remember getting there for my first time on my own, and I was completely blown away by how, traditionally people will cross vertically.
yeah,
There, people were crossing diagonally.
all the
I've
time.
never seen that. I was so blown away
Uh-huh.
because my construct and the narrative that I was framing around how to cross the road was that you cross this way, and let's say you have to get to the diagonal point, and then you cross at the 90-degree angle. But there, it's just diagonal. And
Yeah.
I was so blown away by it. And no one seemed afraid.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. People have things to do. So that being said,
People got lives to live.
yeah, but I was crossing the street, and as usual, people were on the same, street crossing with a red light right in front of them. And there was a quite elderly man who wasn't 100% with it, it appeared. And he was just sort of dawdling along, and he didn't look both ways, which is really best practice. And a car was coming right at him, and I screamed, step back, step back. And he, after saying it a couple of times, he did, and he sort of dawdled backwards right as the car whizzed by. So I could have said nothing because I didn't want to. I could have said, well, I'm not going to put fear in his heart. But then he would have just been slush on the street.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people really do need to be afraid, and it's up to us to make them afraid. And then there's more universal things. If you are in Cambodia and in a rural area and you are riding on a road,
Yeah.
do not get off the road.
Mm-hmm.
You should be afraid to do that because there may be a landmine that will blow you to bits.
Mm-hmm.
People do need to be afraid. We can't sit and say, well, don't let your fear get in the way of exploring this beautiful rice paddy.
Yeah.
Come on.
Mm-hmm. No, I think there's a lot to be said. I think this is a really interesting topic, but just for the sake of our time, I wanted to just acknowledge a couple things that could be actually great topics for us to explore in the upcoming days. One of them is if fear is apparent, what do you choose to pass on to other people from that perspective? And whether or not the kids act upon it or not, or they see it. I think that's a great topic. So I want to thank Melody for sharing that. But Scott, in regard to you, how can people connect with you and learn more about what you have going on and what you've been up to in the past?
My podcast.
I've known you.
Thank you. My podcast, Scott Mason's Purpose Highway, can be found at purposehighway.com. We are discussing this season what I call the silent revolution, which is the profound collapse of engagement in the historical institutions through which people have found connection through a search for meaning. And the secret plague, which is the lack of connection and lack of pathway that the collapse of those institutions causes for those who are seeking connection through the search for meaning. If you are interested in meaning, and by that I mean purpose, ethics, spirituality, and want to know how people are coming up with new pathways to connect with each other in their search for meaning, this is the podcast for you. And we're having fantastic guests and incredible audience response. We would love anyone who's watching or listening to this to join our movement.
And I'll say the same exact words that you just said. Having been a guest on the show, it was a profound and a very inspiring space to be a part of. Just how open the conversation is, just like this. I think there's beauty in having a dialogue where, at least for me, I don't believe there's a wrong or right way of doing it, but personally, I prefer conversations that are a lot more conversational And I think that's something that you excel in and have really done a really great job with the other people that you've had on the show as well.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Of course. Of course.
Really do.
So I know that we are wrapping up right now, and so for anyone that's listening and that was able to maybe read my lips at the beginning because there was no sound, I wanted to repeat a couple of things. So first one is an invitation to an event through Jessica Dugas, who had joined us through this show, and that's where we're going to be featured as one of the nonprofits as part of that event. So for anyone that's interested, there's a link at the bottom here. Please check it out. If you need more information, connect with myself or Scott, and then we can introduce all of you to that particular experience. And outside of that, just wanted to say thank you to everyone who has supported our work and our episode. And if anyone wants to support us even further, all I ask is people to either contribute to our cause, leave us a review, and Facebook, LinkedIn, iTunes, wherever people can find us. And it's truly a joy to have people who are a part of this.
Well, and Oleg, I mean, I just have to interject here. When you go to overcomingodds.today, the website for this amazing nonprofit that you are the head of, you're also going to find links to your websites. To your podcasts, I mean. And both of those are experiences that are unique in of their own right. They are worth hearing, and they have truly given people a power to express their stories and bring it out in the world that there's nothing else like out there. And that's how lives, the future, even the fabric of reality itself has changed.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think for me, the big thing that I've learned in starting a lot of this is just the power that it carries in being able to create a space, not only for people to be heard and to be seen, but ultimately to transform their own lives on their own terms. I think there's something to be said about creating that space and possibility where people can define their own life and not necessarily follow the steps, so to speak, that you and I might have crafted, as well as anyone else that's a part of it. And I think if anything, what I've learned is that it starts with a conversation.
I say this with passion and every bit of conviction in my heart. And that is, we each only live one life. Make sure that you find the power of your story, like you do in your show, is the only one you've got.